What if the richest man in the city crashed right outside the poorest garage in town, and the only person who could save him was a broke, forgotten mechanic? What if that one act of kindness pulled him into a world of secrets, danger, and a deal that could change everything? Would you take the risk or walk away? Jake Miller slumped on a rickety stool in Miller's auto shop, the air heavy with the acrid tang of motor oil and despair. At 32, he carried the weight of a life that had worn him down to the bone. The garage, a crumbling brick box on the edge of Redstone, was all that remained of his father, Frank, who taught him to coax life from broken engines with a craftsman's touch. Frank's hands, calloused and steady, had guided Jake's through his first carburetor repair at 12, his laughter filling the shop like sunlight. But cancer stole Frank 7 years ago, and now the garage was dying too. Foreclosure notices piled up, tools rusted in their racks, and Jake's dreams of keeping his father's legacy alive were fading into the cracks of the concrete floor. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting jagged shadows over the workbench where Jake's phone buzzed. A text from his younger sister, Lila, glowed on the screen. "Jake, call me. You don't have to do this alone." Lila had left Redstone for a city job, her voice always tinged with worry when she called. She didn't understand why Jake clung to the garage, why he couldn't let go of the place where he still heard his father's voice in the hum of an engine, saw his smile in the gleam of a polished hood. Jake ignored the text, his fingers tracing the edge of a closed permanently sign he'd scrawled that morning. The ink was smudged, his hands trembling as he wrote it. This was it, the end of everything. He cracked open a warm beer, the hiss echoing in the empty garage. It was 11:47 p.m., and Redstone was asleep, the town as worn out as Jake felt. He took a sip, the bitter taste doing little to dull the ache in his chest. He thought of his father's last words, "Fix what's broken, son." Always. But some things couldn't be fixed, not the bank's demands, not the leaking roof, not the hollow feeling that had settled in his gut. The blast shook the garage, rattling tools off their hooks and shattering a coffee mug on the floor. Jake dove behind the workbench, his heart slamming against his ribs. Glass crunched outside, and a wave of heat poured through the cracked windows. Grabbing a fire extinguisher, he stumbled to the door, the night air thick with smoke and the roar of flames. Across the street, a Rolls Royce Phantom burned, its sleek frame twisted into a grotesque skeleton. A car like that didn't belong in Redstone, a town of rusted pickups and fading dreams. A figure crawled from the wreckage, his suit charred, his face streaked with blood and ash. Jake dropped the extinguisher and ran to him, the heat searing his skin. The man collapsed, gasping, but his eyes locked onto Jake's with a fierce, almost unnatural clarity. Jake knelt, checking for a pulse, faint, but there. "Stay still," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm calling for help." "No." The man's hand shot out, gripping Jake's wrist with desperate strength. His voice was low, urgent, cutting through the crackle of flames. "No police. No ambulance. This wasn't an accident. Someone tried to kill me. You're the only one I trust." Jake froze, the words hitting like a punch. The man's eyes burned with a strange calm, too composed for someone who'd just crawled from a fireball. Every instinct screamed to run, to call 911, to get out of whatever this was. But something in that gaze, fear, yes, but also resolve, held him. Against his better judgment, Jake nodded. "Okay, let's get you inside." Jake half-carried, half-dragged the man into the garage, locking the door behind them. He laid him on a musty cot in the back, grabbing a first aid kit from a shelf coated in dust and cobwebs. The man winced as Jake cleaned his burns, but he didn't complain, his jaw set like he was used to pain. Up close, Jake recognized him, Maxwell Reed, the billionaire who owned half the tech world but lived like a ghost. Jake had seen his face on a magazine at Rosie's Diner last month, a rare glimpse of a man who avoided cameras. What was someone like Maxwell Reed doing in a nowhere town like Redstone? "I'm Jake," he said, wrapping gauze around Maxwell's blistered arm. "You're lucky to be alive." "Maxwell," the man rasped, his voice like sandpaper. "Luck's got nothing to do with it." Jake raised an eyebrow, focusing on the task to keep his nerves in check. He dabbed antiseptic on a gash across Maxwell's forehead, the billionaire's eyes scanning the garage, rusted tools, oil-stained concrete, a flickering neon sign that read Miller's Auto. Jake's gut screamed to call the sheriff, but Maxwell's words, "Someone tried to kill me," echoed in his head. Redstone wasn't a stranger to secrets. Jake had seen deals go down in back alleys, heard whispers of corruption at the town hall. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but something about Maxwell's certainty made him pause. "Why me?" Jake asked, leaning against a workbench cluttered with wrenches and receipts. "You don't know me. Why trust a guy like me?" Maxwell's lips twitched, almost a smile, though pain tightened his features. "You ran toward the fire, not away. Most people don't. That tells me who you are." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He handed Maxwell a water bottle, watching as he drank slowly, his eyes never leaving the door. The billionaire began to talk, his voice low but gaining strength, like a man unburdening a weight he'd carried too long. "That explosion was deliberate," Maxwell said. "Someone in my company wants me dead. They're after something I was carrying, a prototype for a clean energy engine. It's small, fits in a briefcase, but it's worth $500 million. Maybe more. It could power entire cities, end reliance on oil. If it works, it changes the world." Jake's jaw tightened. He glanced out the window, where the Rolls Royce still smoldered, its flames casting eerie shadows across the street. "You're saying that thing's in there?" Maxwell corrected, his voice sharp. "I hit it before the car blew. In the trunk, under a false panel. They think it's destroyed, which is why they haven't come for me yet. But they will." Jake's heart sank as headlights pierced the darkness. Two black SUVs pulled into the empty lot across the street, their engines idling like predators waiting to strike. He ducked below the window, his pulse racing. Maxwell followed his gaze, his face grim. "They're here," Maxwell whispered. "My own security team. I saw their logo, a stylized R, on their gear before the explosion." Jake's mind spun. Assassins? In Redstone? He was a mechanic, not a soldier. He'd fix cars, not conspiracies. But the fear in Maxwell's eyes was real, and so were the shadows moving outside. Jake made a choice, one that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a crowbar from the workbench. "I'm checking it out." Maxwell grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Be careful, Jake. These people don't leave loose ends." Jake crept to the back door, peering through the grimy window. The SUVs hadn't moved, but he counted 3 men now, their silhouettes sharp against the dying firelight. One stepped out, wearing a black jacket with the R logo Maxwell described. He moved with the precision of a hunter, scanning the street, his hand resting on a holstered gun. Jake's stomach churned, but he forced himself to focus, his father's voice echoing. "Fix what's broken, son." Right now, that meant keeping Maxwell alive. He returned to the cot, where Maxwell was already on his feet, inspecting the garage like a tactician. "Got tools I can use?" Maxwell asked. "We need to salvage that prototype before they find it." "You're in no shape to move," Jake snapped, gesturing at Maxwell's burns. "And that car's a furnace." "The prototype's not in the main compartment," Maxwell said, his voice urgent but controlled. "It's in the trunk, hidden under a false panel. If we get it, we can protect it. If not, they win, and the world loses." Jake stared at him, torn between disbelief and a strange pull to act. He'd spent his life fixing broken things, engines, transmissions, his own fractured dreams. This was bigger, but it wasn't different. It was a problem to solve, a machine to save. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "But we'd do this my way." They devised a plan. Jake would retrieve the prototype, while Maxwell stayed hidden, ready to signal if the men got too close. Jake grabbed a welding torch, a pry bar, and his battered laptop, its cracked screen still functional for diagnostics. Maxwell described the module, a fist-sized device packed with experimental tech, its circuits more complex than anything Jake had seen. They had to move fast. The men outside were circling closer, their boots crunching on gravel. Jake slipped out the back, staying low in the shadows. The Rolls Royce was a blackened husk, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The air reeked of burnt rubber and metal. He pried open the trunk, his hands slick with sweat, and found the false panel Maxwell described. Inside was a metal case, scorched but intact, its surface warm to the touch. He grabbed it and bolted back to the garage, the SUV's headlights flickering like eyes in the dark. Inside, Maxwell's face lit up as Jake opened the case. The module was damaged, circuits melted, wires frayed, but salvageable. Jake's hands moved on instinct, stripping wires, soldering connections, using tricks he'd learned fixing tractors and beat-up sedans. Maxwell guided him, explaining the tech in terms Jake could grasp. Power flows, cooling systems, circuit redundancy. They worked like a team, two men against a ticking clock, the hum of the module their only soundtrack. But the SUVs were closing in. Jake heard voices outside, low and clipped, followed by the creak of the garage's front door. He rigged a distraction, a stack of tires doused with gasoline, wired to ignite with a spark from his laptop. He hit the key, and flames roared across the lot, drawing the men's attention. Jake and Maxwell slipped into the garage's basement, a damp, cluttered space filled with junk from Frank's days. Old engines, crates of parts, a rusted bicycle Jake used to ride. In the dim light, they set up on a workbench. The modules faint hum a lifeline. Jake's hands were steady, but his mind raced. He was risking everything, his home, his life, for a man he barely knew, for a device he didn't fully understand. But something in Maxwell's resolve, in the way he spoke of the prototype's potential, kept Jake moving. This wasn't just about survival. It was about fixing something bigger than himself. The basement was a cocoon of shadows, the only light coming from a flickering bulb and the module's faint glow. Jake soldered a final connection, his hand steady despite the blood pounding in his ears. Maxwell watched, his burn stark against his pale skin, his eyes never leaving the device. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, and the words changed everything. "There's something I didn't tell you," Maxwell said, his gaze fixed on the module. "The prototype isn't just an energy source. In the wrong hands, it's a weapon. It could overload power grids, cripple economies, even detonate like a small EMP. That's why they want it, and why they want me dead." Jake's wrench slipped, clattering to the floor. His heart sank, anger rising like bile. "You lied to me," he growled, stepping toward Maxwell. "I risked everything for you, and you're telling me this thing's a bomb?" "I didn't lie," Maxwell said, his eyes meeting Jake's without flinching. "I omitted the part that could get you killed. I needed you to trust me, Jake. I still do. This prototype can save the world, or destroy it. We have to protect it." Jake's fist clenched, his mind spinning. He'd put his life on the line, turned his back on every instinct. For a weapon? He thought of his father, who'd taught him to build, not destroy. He wanted to smash the module, walk away, let Maxwell deal with his own mess. But the footsteps above stopped him cold. The men were inside the garage now, their shadows moving across the basement door, their voices muffled but urgent. "We don't have time," Maxwell said, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. It was small, unremarkable, but his hands trembled as he held it. "This has the schematics, the full design. If I don't make it, get it to someone you trust. Not the police, not the media. Someone who'll do the right thing." Jake's anger churned, but he took the drive, slipping it into his pocket. The basement door rattled, then burst open. 3 men in black stormed in, guns drawn, their faces obscured by tactical masks. Jake reacted on instinct, swinging his pipe wrench and catching one in the shoulder. The man grunted, stumbling, but the second lunged, his gun aimed at Jake's chest. Maxwell tackled him, ignoring his burns, his movements fueled by desperation. The third man fired, the bullet grazing Jake's arm, searing like fire. Jake didn't stop. He slammed the third man against the wall, knocking him out with a crack of the wrench. The fight was brutal, chaotic, over in seconds. Jake and Maxwell tied the men with jumper cables, their breaths ragged in the stale air. Jake's arm bled, but he ignored it, grabbing the module and the toolbox. "We need to move," he said, his voice hoarse. Maxwell nodded, his face pale but resolute. They slipped out the back, the night air cold against Jake's skin. The SUVs were still out there, their engines idling, but the distraction had bought them time. They ran, the module hidden in the toolbox, heading for the only place Jake could think of, Tom's farm, 10 miles outside Redstone. Tom's farm was a sprawling patch of land, its barns and fields a sanctuary from Redstone's decay. Tom, a burly ex-Marine with a limp from an old injury, met them at the gate, his eyes narrowing at Maxwell's burns and Jake's bloodied arm. "You're in deep shit, aren't you?" he said, but he didn't hesitate, ushering them into a barn that smelled of hay and diesel. Jake collapsed onto a bale, the module safe in the toolbox. Maxwell sat across from him, his breathing shallow but steady. Tom patched them up, his medic training kicking in as he cleaned Jake's wound and bandaged Maxwell's burns. "You owe me a beer for this," Tom muttered, but his eyes were soft with worry. As dawn broke, Jake pulled out his laptop, its cracked screen flickering to life. He uploaded the garage's security footage to a local news site, the grainy video showing the explosion, Jake dragging Maxwell from a wreckage, and the SUVs with the R logo circling like wolves. He typed a message, "Billionaire's car explodes in Redstone. Truth coming soon." His finger hovered over the send button, his heart pounding. This would change everything. By noon, the story was everywhere. News vans clogged Redstone streets, their satellite dishes sprouting like weeds. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their blades slicing the air. The footage went viral, CNN, BBC, X, every platform lighting up with Jake's name, his face, his story. He watched from the barn, his arm throbbing, the module hidden beneath a tarp. Reporters called him a hero, a small-town mechanic who'd saved a billionaire. But Jake didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd stumbled into a war he didn't understand. Maxwell, patched up and sipping water, looked at Jake with something like awe. "You could have sold the prototype," he said, "or taken the fame, the money. Why didn't you?" Jake thought of his father, the garage, the kids in Redstone who'd never had a chance. He thought of Lila, who'd begged him to leave, and the weight of the USB drive in his pocket. "I didn't do it for money," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I did it because it was right." Maxwell's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. "Come work with me, Jake. Not as a mechanic, as a partner. Build the future with me. This prototype, it's just a start. We can make the world better." Jake hesitated. He thought of Redstone, of the garage's oil-stained floors, of his father's laugh echoing in the hum of an engine. But he also saw the module, its potential to light up cities, to give kids like him a chance at something bigger. "Deal," he said, extending a hand. Maxwell shook it, his grip weak but earnest. Months later, Jake stood in a gleaming lab in Silicon Valley, the module humming on a workbench under sterile lights. Maxwell's company, Reed Innovations, was rebuilding its traders, executives tied to oil conglomerates, exposed and arrested after the footage sparked a federal investigation. The prototype was safe, its weaponized potential locked away in a secure vault, its clean energy design moving toward production. Jake was no longer a broke mechanic. He was lead engineer on a project that could redefine the world, his name synonymous with hope and resilience. He'd saved the garage, turning it into a community workshop where Redstone's kids learned to fix cars, their laughter filling the space where his father's voice once echoed. Lila flew in from the city, her eyes brimming with tears as she hugged him in the lab. "Dad would be so proud," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't just save the garage, Jake. You saved yourself." Jake's throat tightened, his eyes stinging as he thought of Frank, his steady hands, his quiet pride, his belief that fixing things was a kind of love. He saw his father in Lila's smile, in the kids wielding wrenches, in the hum of the module that could light up the world. But the USB drive, hidden in his apartment safe, was a constant weight. Maxwell swore the weaponized design was destroyed, but Jake wasn't naive. He'd seen the greed in those executives' eyes, the lengths they'd go to control power. Late at night, he'd catch himself checking the locks, scanning the shadows, the drive a reminder that some secrets never stay buried. One evening, as the lab emptied, Jake sat alone with the module. The hum was steady, almost comforting, like the engines he'd fixed with his father. He pulled out his phone and called Lila, his voice low. "If anything happens to me," he said, "there's a drive in my apartment, in the safe. Combo's dad's birthday. Get it to Tom. He'll know what to do." "Jake, you're scaring me," Lila said, her voice trembling. "You're safe now, right?" "I'm okay," he lied, his eyes on the module. "Just keep the kids dreaming, okay? Teach them to fix things, like Dad did." He hung up, his gaze drifting to a photo on his desk, him and Frank, grinning outside the garage. Jake no older than 10, holding a wrench like a trophy. The module glowed softly, a beacon of hope, but also a target. The people who tried to kill Maxwell were gone, but others would come. Jake wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a guardian of his father's legacy, of Redstone's future, of a world that could be better. He tightened his grip on a wrench, his father's voice clear in his mind. "Fix what's broken, son. Always." Jake smiled, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. Whatever came next, greed, betrayal, danger, he'd face it. For his father, for Lila, for the kids in Redstone who deserve a chance, for the future he'd help build, one repair at a time.